Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lunch with Science. I'm Ariel Johnson from the Leakey Foundation, and today we're exploring Neanderthal fire technology. Be sure to let us know where you're tuning in from in the chat or the video description. And if you want to be a part of the next great discovery, we have special opportunities for your donations to be doubled. So check out our YouTube giving fundraiser or website. Today, Leakey Foundation grantee Giulia Gallo joins us from the East Coast of the US. Julie is a postdoctoral researcher at the Collège de France in Paris. She has worked at several middle and upper Paleolithic sites in Eurasia and Western Europe. Her research is currently focused on the sites of Roc de Marsal, Pestalozzi, or Les Montresors, or oh no, I got it wrong. She'll tell you. And Comcornal, and she examines burnt bones at these sites to document the fire use behaviors of ancient hominids. She's also done work in Belgium, in Germany, and Mongolia. So, Giulia, just thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry, some of those site names are just so hard to pronounce.
You know, I got through most of them, so that's
you did. No, really. No, and I really love having the opportunity to talk about my research, and I've so looked forward to joining you for this lunch break science. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, it's fun to talk about. We've not talked about fire technology really before, and it's obviously it's considered to be a very important part of our evolutionary story. Before we had the episode, and we'll show it again here, we had a quiz up where we were asking viewers to assess which of these bones are found at an archaeological site are not burnt. So let's take a look at those again. So, I mean, it's really cool to see these, close-ups of bones found at a site. So I guess to better I guess how do you know which ones? I guess which ones are burnt and which ones aren't burnt?
Yeah. So it turns out assessing burning can be really, really hard. And I've taken years to build up to a skill set where I can distinguish between burning. But I have to be honest, I use a lot of analyses, specifically spectroscopic analyses, to help me see if it's burned or stained, especially in situations where my eye can't tell. So it turns out that only answer A, the blue bone, is actually burned. B is a stained bone. In fact, so here's a close-up image of these blue bones. Blue coloration only occurs with high temperatures, but it's not the high temperature that gives it that blue coloration. I think we're going to have time to talk about it more later, so I won't do a full spoiler. But that is the burned bone. The answer B actually is a stained bone. It is manganese staining. And the answer C actually was so tricky, even when I was looking at it myself. But in fact, it is humic acid and is not burning. So turns out it can be really hard to tell sometimes.
Well, to better understand the use of fire in the context of our history, we actually had we released a video before the episode where we asked people to guess what was the earliest evidence of anthropogenic fire, both when and where. So I guess, do you want to answer those questions?
Yeah, I'm excited to see what people thought. And I'm also so curious if people find this information surprising, because for me, we think that fire is so important. There's these assumptions that it was so crucial to our evolution and our survival. But fire actually comes across quite late in our toolkit of human technology. So the current strongest, earliest evidence for anthropogenic fire, and that's human-made or curated fire, is actually from 1 million years ago at a site called Wonderwork in South Africa. So Wonderwork is a cave, and through microstratigraphic thin sections, geoarchaeologists were able to see lenses of burnt bone and ash that were not brought in from water flow from outside of the cave, like a wildfire burns some stuff and then it comes in. No, this is evidence of in situ fire. And although, so it hasn't been contested, some people remain skeptical or wish there was stronger evidence for earlier fire. But in fact, this is it. At 1 million years ago in South Africa, our current landmark for a most likely anthropogenic fire. I find it really compelling. And I want to pose or see if our audience knows what hominin would have been at wonderwork at that time. Because in fact, it wasn't Homo sapiens like our lineage. The oldest or the earliest Homo sapiens comes around, 300,000 years ago, and the fire evidence from wonderwork is at 1 million years ago. So it turns out we're not entirely sure exactly which hominin it was, but most researchers are in consensus that it was likely a member of our genus Homo. So maybe we can have more answers in the next decade of fire research. And finally, to answer the second part of our question, I'll just briefly go into when fire was seen to be more frequent, more common. Because if fire was so important and so useful after wonderwork, wouldn't we think that it would be seen everywhere? Everyone would be cooking every meal, everyone would be making it for warmth and light. But actually, the next strongest evidence for fire comes from the site of Gesher B'nai Yaakov, and that's around 800, 700, maybe 600,000 years ago. So that's way after 1 million years ago down in South Africa. And nothing again, no frequent fire use comes until after 400,000 years ago. So we have this timeline of one of our strongest evidence for early fire at 1 million, again, compelling evidence at 800,000, and it doesn't get used a lot. It's not so frequent in the archaeological record that we think hominins are obligate or habitual fire users until 400,000 years ago. And I actually think there's a lot to unpack with the terms habitual or obligate fire users, and I think we'll have time to answer those questions later.
Well, I just want to do a quick shout out because we have quite a few people watching live. Susan Moralevi, hello, Steve, Sakani, Marlena, David, Teresa, Tam, Gabby, Hector, Pillow, and Robin. Thank you so much for tuning in from all over the world to watch the episode today. Before we turn the virtual floor over to Giulia, if you want to learn more about human evolution, and amazing research going on all over the world, like Giulia's and the latest discoveries, start by subscribing to our channel and clicking that notification bell so you don't miss a thing. Now, let's turn over the virtual floor and hear more about Giulia's research.
So, hi everyone. I wanted to give a brief introduction to my research and the scope of my studies and how I'm addressing Neanderthal fire use. But also, I'm going to let you know my background because we're going to have plenty of time for questions and answers. So, I'm actually very, very curious in what you want to know about Neanderthal fire use. But yeah, I'll fill you in on a couple of background slides before we get started with the Q&A. And thank you, Ariel, for setting me up. So if we're thinking about fire, this introduction of fire as the archaeology of fire as an artifact is quite recent. I would say it's been more trendy the past decade. I find fire compelling because actually it lends a really complementary perspective compared to lithic analyses and faunal analyses. So fire is actually an integral part for me of both social and economic behaviors of hominins. And the whole reason I wanted to be an archaeologist and what gets me up in the morning is, in fact, I'm so curious about hominin behavioral diversity in the past. So fire for me is like an excellent lens to ask these types of questions about behavioral variability. And coming back to that term, social and economic, it's interesting from a social perspective because for me, social management includes the management of persons, of objects, of things, the organization of space, whereas economic organization counts more for like the management of resources. And in fact, studying fire gives me insight on both. I want to let you know that I use bone to study fire, and there's so many different ways to study fire. So you could be a geoarchaeologist, you can look at burned lithics, but my perspective as a zooarchaeologist is that bones are an extremely dynamic biomaterial and can give me so much information about the conditions under which they were burned, the circumstances that led bone being in that fire. So I'm a big advocate for using bone to study ancient fire. And now my presentation today is about Neanderthals. And while I'm technically interested in studying the fire of any hominin, I'm so curious about the earlier fires. I'm curious about the difference between Neanderthal and Homo sapien fires. Much of my research so far and what I completed my dissertation at UC Davis is on Neanderthal fire. And I think Neanderthals are an excellent case study to start asking these questions about hominid behavioral diversity, specifically with fire. Because yes, we do have examples of earlier fire, but we don't have like such a rich archaeological record from those really, really early examples. Whereas for Neanderthals, we have dense, well-studied collections, lots of data points. And for me to be able to test some detailed hypotheses, I wanted a really deep archaeological record. And Neanderthals are closely related to us, they're contemporaneous to us, but in fact, they can give us insight maybe on, again, the term hominin behavioral diversity. What was behavioral diversity like in the Middle Pleistocene? How different were humans and Neanderthals? And how did they use this technology to survive some pretty intense times in Western Europe and Eurasia? So that's my spiel for fire, bones, and Neanderthals. But to give you a bit more detail about my own research. So, of course, I work with archaeological material, and that is taken from excavations of archaeological sites, like much data is. So, there's the excavation phase, there's the sieving and screening phase, the drying phase, and then where I come in as a specialist is that I actually sort the material that comes from the tamis, the screened material. I sort out the burnt bone, then I sort the burnt bone into different categories based on my research questions. I then make any identifications, I look for any anthropogenic cut marks, and then I do a lot of analyses, like chemistry style analyses in labs. And this is both to confirm burning, get information about the temperature reached, the duration of burning, the atmosphere of burning, and I also supplement them with my own experiments to kind of fill in the blanks and help us hone in more closer on the fire properties which altered these bones. Now, I can really see the chemical and structural changes that happen to the organic and the mineral portion of bone that co-occur with thermal alteration. So when I speak about my analyses, I really am speaking about learning about what's going on the nano and micro scale of bone. And as you can see here, the difference between the 300 degrees Celsius and the 700 degrees Celsius burnt bone is quite different on the scale. So I can really do things like confirm burning. So I don't always have to use my eyes if the coloration is confusing. Now, I'll be speaking broadly today. I'm curious to know what you want to know about Neanderthal fire, but I have studied Neanderthal fire in southern France and in Belgium. So I'll be presenting data and what I know about Roc de Marsal, Comgrenol, Le Moustier, and Pestalozzi 4, as well as Turel West up in Belgium. Now, this does cover a pretty wide range of ages because Neanderthals were around for like a really long time. So the oldest site that I have studied is Pestalozzi 4. The layer that I've studied there is around 100,000 years ago from like MIS 5. MIS stands for like marine isotope stage. It's not a glacial period. Roc de Marsal comes next, around 90,000 years ago. Now, Le Moustier, I've actually studied the entire 3-meter sequence. So that's going to cover around 60, maybe 70,000 years ago up until 37. Comgrenol, I'm studying a specific period, a very cold glacial period, and that's around 60 to 74,000 years ago. And Turel West is actually quite young, so it's closer to 40,000 years ago. Now, when I think about this is the perspective that I can speak to you about fire, but of course I am staying appraised at what other teams are doing and studying. So I'll be able to talk broadly about Neanderthal behavior, but I can specifically answer your questions about these sites, and it does cover a pretty decent time range. A lot of different environments are also covered in this time range. So for example, Roc de Marsal and Pech 4, the fire I've studied there comes from a really warm and temperate period. We're talking about forests, there's deer. From Comgrenol, I'm studying that very cold period. So we're thinking a dry, arid, steppe landscape, very cold. Le Moustier covers a bit of both, in fact, and there's something relevant to cold behavior that I'm really excited to show you. And Turel West is so young, it's actually in a more temperate period again. Now, just to show you some photos from my work excavating these sites, I was able to join the Pech 4 team when we excavated blocks out of the fire layer, this layer 8, and we worked on those blocks in laboratory settings. And I've also joined Le Moustier, and comb granule for normal excavation seasons. So, we have a bit of typic excavation protocol and some interesting laboratory work as well. Now, if I wanted to share with you what we know about Neanderthal fire use today, I don't know if you would find it surprising. In general, I could say they did use fire. They knew how to use fire. They had sophisticated ways of making, using, and placing their fires. So maybe that's not so surprising because they were large-brained social hominins, contemporaries with Homo sapiens, making sophisticated stone tools, hunting really difficult animals to hunt. So what do we know? We know they made fire. They made great fire. And I hope I can push my research past just identifying the presence and absence of fire into giving us more details about the how, when, where, and why of fire. So I'll share a little bit of that now. So how were Neanderthals making fire? Well, from my experience, as well as what I know other teams have described, they're certainly using organic fuel. Really excellent work done at a cluster of sites in Spain have shown that they're using organic fuel like vegetation fuel. And what's most commonly seen in the fires is what's most common on the landscape. They've also noted for one site that or actually two sites, they have noticed wood that would have been really good for making smoking fires. So they've described the use of vegetation, rotted vegetation for making smoke, which has a lot of useful functions if you're thinking about a hunter and gathering society. Now, sometimes we have a few very rare evidence of bone fuel. So fires primarily fueled by bone. But actually, more often, in almost all the fires I've studied, bone was incorporated into fires but wasn't the main fuel. And I can describe in a bit more detail why bone might be included in a fire, and it turns out it adds a lot of benefits. So I think Neanderthals are making really interesting decisions when it comes to how to fuel their fires, what to put in their fires for desired functional purposes like smoke. And I'll get to you a bit more about the heat and light properties as well. So we're thinking about, how they're making their fires, how hot are these fires? There's a distribution in temperatures reached, especially in my experience, looking specifically at the temperatures of all of these Neanderthal fires. I see low temperature fires and I see really, really high temperature fires. And the only thing to mention for these really high temperature fires is that they're not possible without human creation. These are so much hotter and they're lasting longer than any natural fire. Like wildfires are typically fast. They reach the temperature of a normal barbecue, but not much more. Some of these Neanderthal fires are so hot, guys. So I found this fun graphic kind of to orient you with the temperatures reached, on a 2024 barbecue. So if you're smoking, you're around 225 Fahrenheit, which is around 100 Celsius. If you're grilling meat, like here, the best temperature for chicken, 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's around 170 Celsius. Now for a hot fire, for searing, this iconographic tells you to, grill at 475 Fahrenheit, which is still under 250 C. So these Neanderthal fires I study, I am seeing many fires dominated around 500 degrees Celsius, and many fires that are averaging above 700 degrees Celsius, which is above 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. So these are hot, big fires. And maybe if we have time and questions, we can discuss why would you need a fire that hot? But I'll move on for now. So where are Neanderthals using their fires? One fun thing that I can share from my work, because the site of Roc de Marsal in Layer 9, the fire features have excellent preservation. They are in situ, they are intact. In situ meaning that they are in the place relatively. They have not moved far from the place that they were made and placed. And for Roc de Marsal, the hottest fires are clustered under the drip line. This is also seen at Pech 4. This is also seen at many of the excellent work being done on Spanish sites. Neanderthals seem to be purposefully placing fires under the drip line. A drip line is like where a cave ends. So if it's raining, it's where the water would stop. I think there's many good reasons to have your biggest, hottest fires here. Think about the smoke that would be produced, keeping bugs out of the cave. Think about needing enough oxygen to, fuel these really massive fires. I also think it'd probably be good to have more room, right? On the drip line is not as constrained as inside the cave. But there are some smaller and lower temperature fires in my research farther in the caves as well as on the terrace. So fires are placed in many strategic positions. I find it very interesting that the biggest and hottest ones are consistently found at the strip line. And I believe I have an image here. At least for Roc de Marsalle, we see several instances of stacked features at this really desirable location. So it tells us Neanderthals are making conscious decisions about where they're putting their fires. And this is really cool when you start thinking about site organization and the organization of activities. So I really think that to get a chance to study Roc de Marsalle was a true gift. It was amazing. Now, why are Neanderthals using fire? I'm sure we could brainstorm here a bunch of good reasons, right? And there's like the typical ones. They modify your environment with heat and light. They modify your resources like food or tools. It's good for activities like smoking or drying hides. They also create a social space, which I think is a underrated and really useful tidbit, to think about. Central locations, sharing food, sharing stories, staying up past the night hours because you have heat and light, But what can my research say specifically addressing these why questions? Now, for heat and light, if bone is included in a fire, a lot of bone, and no matter what, bone won't catch by itself. You always need around like 30% fuel to start and keep a bone fire going. But if bone is a major component of a fire, they last longer. They have low brightness but steady flames, and they have bad convection but good it's conduction. I should change that. A bone fire actually has bad conduction, good convection, good radiation properties, which means it can heat the air around the fire well, and it can heat you without going through it. So conduction is where it has to touch to have the heat transfer. So in fact, it's hypothesized that a bone as a major component of a fire actually means a fire that would be effective at heating spaces, would provide steady light, and would increase the duration of a fire feature. Now, what about the cooking food? So some of my sites have such excellent preservation. I can see that these bones were butchered prior to being incorporated in a fire. So I can see cut marks, I can see scraping marks, and this is primarily on bones that are of this middle category of burning, a lower temperature burning. They are here you see like the brown coloration. It means they're carbonized or charred around 300 to 500 degrees Celsius. We don't see it much at higher temperatures, and that's also because at higher temperatures, the surface gets super warped, so in fact, I wouldn't be able to see no matter what. But when you think about how meat might be arranged over a fire, I think it makes sense that bone is either protected by the meat or only exposed a bit. But I think we can assume that Neanderthals are modifying their food with this fire, especially I have some positive examples from Roc de Marsalle, Pechefort, and Le Moustier. Now, something that my research has given a unique perspective on, and I'm really excited to share with you, is that I also have pretty clear evidence that Neanderthals were using fires as a part of their site maintenance behaviors. So we can think of it as garbage disposal. And one cool way to show you this is that the forelimbs of cervids, so here, a picture of a deer, a forelimb is like the bottom of our equivalent of hands or feet. These parts of the body are not really nutritionally dense. The metapodial maybe has really good grease, really nice nutritious marrow, but the tiny little bones and feet bones, there's not much meat there. They're not very useful. They're also surrounded by tendons and sinew. So I have found, both at Pechefort and Roc de Marsalle, a tremendous amount of burned sesamoids and forelimb bones, so carpals, tarsals, little phalanges. And on one hand, you can imagine a group of Neanderthals sitting there, opening this forelimb and flicking, the phalanges into the fire. But I think it's a much stronger likelihood that this complete forelimb was placed in the fire. And this is because I also have sets, not articulated sets, but all of the sesamoids, phalanges, and carpals I would expect in the lower limb of a deer in a single fire burned to a high temperature. So this helps us put together the chain of operation of how hunting ended. So the Neanderthals have hunted the animal, they have brought the animal or portions of the animal back to site, they have cooked the animal, and then parts that are potentially not eaten are added for fuel. And this is seen at many of the fires I've studied, and particularly the hottest and biggest fires. And I'm sure these forelimbs have contributed combustible material to these fires, and maybe also they were added specifically for whatever function that fire had. Now, something that I teased in the quiz, and I hope we have time to talk about as well, are these blue bones, the blue coloration that has turned up on these highly burnt bones. This, again, is an indication for me of site maintenance behaviors and garbage disposal, because this blue coloration comes from bones that are burned that are not fresh bone. So the blue coloration actually comes from a certain amount of diagenetic change, which means the changes that happen after death, after burial, or just picking up things from their surrounding environment, specifically manganese and carbonates. So when an old bone that has picked up these things from the environment is burned, and burned to hot enough temperatures, they turn blue. And I have seen them clustered in a way that has led me to construct this hypothesis that they are burning old bone. So potentially bone that was left by the last Neanderthal group that was there, the last season. Maybe they're putting things in the fire that, just getting going, what's in our environment. But I am making the proposal that this is evidence of more site maintenance behaviors by Neanderthals, and that they're using their fires to clean up some garbage. Now, the last couple slides I will just speak about this variability in fire technology, because this is the question that's so important to me, right? What's going on with hominin behavior in these time periods? And if we're thinking about 50,000 years of Neanderthal fire, what's changing in this time period, and what can that tell? Can it tell us about their population, their demographics, their lifestyles, and what changed before their extinction? Now, I can say, or I'm trying my best, I hope my research speaks to, and I'll need to continue working on it, but I'm wondering if these different temperature fires and different placement fires are speaking to functional differences, if they're meant for different things. As well as there's a certain period in southern France in which we see less fire. So in the coldest periods, when we would expect heat and light to be so important, there's a signature of less fire when you look at the proxies for fire. So like the frequencies of burned bone and the frequencies of burned lithics. So these are questions really driving my interest in variability of fire technology for Neanderthals. And one thing I'll share from Le Moustier is that at the bottom of zone A, which is visible in this photo, and the top of zone B is this very, very cold period. And in fact, I have evidence that they are burning megafauna. They're burning mammoth. And when I was picking up these bones, being like, no way, like this just must be like the biggest bison who ever lived. No, the dental records are also supporting, and the zooms work done by the team of archaeologists at the site have shown that mammoth is present, and I have evidence that they are burning mammoth. And we can talk for a really long time about the advantages or disadvantages of burning megafauna bones, and potentially because there's not much other fuel on the environment in this cold, arid, and dry, glacial period. Also, in terms of variability in this cold period in southern France, so documented as several sites in a culture that we call the Kina. Now, the Kina is a style of making stone tools, or a culture of stone tool. We can discuss it further. But during this Kina period, the Neanderthals seem to be using less fire. And there have been hypotheses proposed by several archaeologists that this in fact means they have lost fire technology, or if they've forgotten how to make fire, or they were only depending on natural fire to get their fire from like lightning strikes. So I think this is a very interesting question. And I am studying with the help, in fact, of the Leakey Foundation. This is my current active project with the foundation. I'm studying a site called Combe Grenal that has a big, like, meter sequence of deposits from this Kina period, including a very dark layer that everyone calls the couche noire, the black layer. So what I have been able to say so far this summer is that there is fire in this level. The couche noire actually is a very interesting, dynamic, confusing layer. If we have questions, I'd love to tell you more about it. But in the bulk of the Kina layer, we are finding fire. So this helps us reorient, not that Neanderthals lost the ability to make fire, but they're doing something different with fire technology in this really cold period. So like maybe a more nuanced question. And so many other things are different in the Kina. Their stone tools are different. They're being highly retouched. Potentially how they hunt animals and how they use kill sites and butchering sites are changing as well. So I'm so excited that my research is going to get to contribute to this question of what's happening in the Kina and how are they surviving this really cold period. So these are all the formal slides I have. I have some extra material if anyone has questions, but I first want to acknowledge and thank everyone who helped me at the Leakey Foundation, Ariel, Eleanor, and Megan. Also the labs that have housed me, UC Davis, the Traces Lab at the University Jean Jaurès, all the work and time I did collecting this data at the Musée National de Préhistoire in France. And thank you so much for our participants. I'm so happy to do this. And yeah, I can't wait to see what you think. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Giulia. And just a special call out to some more of our live viewers, Matthew, Mike, Bizra, Kenyon, Charlotte, and Athanax, and Pete. Thank you for dropping by to post a question. Let us know what you thought of Julie's talk by liking the video and adding your comments. We're actually going to officially end the episode now, but stick around until after the credits, and Giulia will be here to answer all of your questions. So again, please stick around and stay tuned. Giulia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I really am so grateful to have the time to speak about my research, and I hope I hope we can use this as a chance to see what everyone is curious about in terms of Neanderthal behavior.
Great. Well, we're going to end now, and then don't go away because we will be answering all your questions. Lunch Break Science is brought to you by the Leakey Foundation and made possible by the generous support of the Ann and Gordon Getty Foundation, Camilla and George Smith, and the Joan and Arnold Travis Education Fund, as well as viewers like you. Show your support of Lunch Break Science by subscribing to our channel, clicking on notifications, and giving us a thumbs up, or making a donation to help us create new content. Still craving science and can't wait for the next episode? You can feast on the Leakey Foundation's content library with past episodes, lectures, our podcast origin stories, and more. Thank you all for tuning in, and see you next time. Oh, welcome to Lunch Break Science Unanswered Questions, where we will try and get through all of the questions you have submitted here live. But first, I just have a quick question, or probably not a quick question, but it is a question. Blue bone has appeared in the archaeological record for years, but has yet to be really integrated into zooarchaeology. What does, the process of officially describing it involved, and what do you, I guess you talked a little bit about what it signifies, but yeah.
Yeah, so I was so confused by this blue bone when I first started studying these assemblages. And when I tell you they are so blue, my first thought was like, someone dropped a highlighter. Like, whoa, this is crazy behavior. They should have kept that highlighter before they were working with the bone. I then was really unsatisfied with the answers in the archaeological literature. People are like, oh, blue bone is associated with high temperatures, but there should be a reason it is blue. And what if it wasn't only just associated with high temperatures? What if there was an interesting reason that I could link to behavior? So I did end up finding an excellent work by a research group who describes how ivory was used by monks in the Middle Ages. They would actually go and quarry in France mammoth ivory, and they would burn it to make a blue-colored ivory, and it was called odontolite. And the monks actually used it in place of turquoise all the time. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, ivory is not that different from bone. Like, what if it's the same phenomena? So to integrate this, I knew I needed a collaborator who is knowledgeable about chemistry and could help do because I really wanted it to be well described. In fact, when I met my collaborator, Dr. Christophe Duret, who in fact works with hydroxyapatite, which is bone mineral, I said that not only do we need to describe well how it's possible, we need to make sure it can't be possible by many means. We really need to make sure it's like the burning of weathered bone. And also, I really need to make sure archaeologists can duplicate this and do this analyses for their own assemblages. So we need to find a way that it's like cheap and possible for us to redo these analyses on different sites and with different teams. So I am so grateful that I found a chemist willing to help me and to work through the steps. And in fact, with Dr. Jouet and his student Gaetan, they ended up on their side synthesizing hydroxyapatite, so completely fake bone mineral. They doped it with a certain level of different diagenic factors like manganese and carbonates. And we had several trials, right? And they burned some of them and some of them turned blue. So it helped us support what the Reich group found when they were burning mammoth ivory. And it also gave us some clues on what analyses we could do on the archaeological side. Now, this is, I've been working on this for about a year. I really hope that we can publish it in the fall because I really want to publish this before I publish my work on rock demersal and Pesh 4 because this blue bone argument I'm tying to a lot of my hypotheses. So the only issue we've run into is that the archaeological bone, their fragments are so small and the blue coloration is so ephemeral, it's really hard to pick it up on some of these analyses. So we've had good success with like TOF SIMS and fluorescent microscopy, but we've had some difficulty, like SEM doesn't pick up anything, XRD doesn't pick up anything, because it's just such a little amount only on the surface. It's like below the limit of detection. So we're figuring that out now. We want to get that out as soon as possible. And I really hope it can help zooarchaeologists, incorporated less in the geological mineral science literature and put it in the archaeological literature. Other zooarchaeological teams can use this and test their own assemblages. So that's kind of the process of how it's happening, and I'm really excited to see the final publication come out.
Well, we will definitely be sharing that publication when it comes out because it's a very exciting, and I just need to hear about the process. It is, and it's just like it's crazy that it hadn't been described.
Yeah,
and there's tons of things out there that have not officially been described. So great opportunities out there to find. So we're going to take next a question from our viewers from Robin, who asks. Let's see here. Is there any evidence that once Neanderthals are using fire, did this increase their caloric intake, such as their brain size increased as accelerated rate over time?
So there's no doubt that both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens have the largest cranial capacity of any hominin before us, right? We have the biggest brains. Now, when it comes time to within the Neanderthal, like the classic Neanderthal period, there isn't a tremendous increase between like the start of what we see Neanderthals and the last Neanderthals. So I'm not sure if I'm sure cooking could help them increase their calorie intake, but heating something with fire actually doesn't add calories. It just helps with mastication and digestion. So it kind of saves you calories. So you get more calories from your food. But what I think your question is really interesting, if we look a little bit earlier, so I think I mentioned before, we have this one example of early fire at 1 million. Then we have like, maybe an example at 600,000, 800 to 600,000, but it doesn't like get on. It really becomes common at 400,000 years ago. And at this point, this is when we see the classic Neanderthals and Homo sapiens coming around 300,000 years ago. So certainly our big brain size coincides with when we see higher frequencies of fire use. So I think they could be tied. And I certainly think there's a cooking hypothesis, which is made popular by Dr. Richard Wrangham. And he thinks that using fire potentially helped our brain size increase earlier on in our evolutionary history. For me, this timing is really awesome, closer to 400,000 years ago. So the precursors, the ancestors of Homo sapien and Neanderthals, I think it's likely they begin using fire more often, and this helps, get our brain capacity to where it is now.
So, you work at some amazing sites. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the different sites you're at and what's happening and what's kind of most exciting right now?
Sure. I'm so proud of the sites I work at and the teams I'm working with. So I'm really focusing on France right now, and I have active work with the sites of Roc de Marsal, Le Moustier. I'm finishing work at Roc de Marsal as well as Pêche 4. Now, some of these sites like Le Moustier, which is the type site for the Mousterian, for me, it's so cool. It's like a celebrity site, and the density of material is absolutely out of control. So to get to say something about the fire use of the Neanderthals of Le Moustier that represents some of the last Neanderthals in the region is like a total pleasure. And I do know, actually, one thing that I can highlight before I go back to maybe some cool discoveries we had this summer is that in our promo video, my emergency alert bracelet was prominent. And I even want to give my sites a shout out. I have severe anaphylactic food allergies, which certainly makes doing fieldwork difficult. But not only am I working at these awesome sites, they are making sure people who need accommodations like me are fed, are safe, are made to feel welcome. So just an extra shout out. Not only are these awesome teams, but they're really awesome in making an inclusive archaeology. And I think a more inclusive archaeology makes for better science. So I'll give them, I'm very grateful, and I'm so happy to be a part of their teams. This summer at Comgrenal, which is another giant sequence, really, really excellent research being done there, we are coming upon in this Kina layer where Francois Board, an archaeologist who worked at Comgrenal earlier, actually found Neanderthal remains that have cut marks on them, so potential cannibalism or ritual behaviors. So we did not find any Neanderthals this year, but getting to work and come upon this layer, I think some really exciting things are going to come from the research being done at Comgrenal. Yeah, so keep your eye out for the next couple of years.
And okay, so let's take another question from our viewers. Let's see here. Who do we have next? We have quite a few questions, so.
Well, that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Steve asked, do you know if the Neanderthal spears that were found showed fire hardened tips? And I guess that was a response to Charlotte's question.
Yeah, I think the response is to what happens to lithics when they're heat treated. So in fact, it realigns their crystals and you can get sharper edges, you can make cleaner cuts. So especially when you're working with really crappy material, heat treatment is pretty cool. Now, I'm not entirely sure of the exact Neanderthal spears you're speaking of, but I do know actually when I was showing, we were discussing how difficult it is to assess burning sometimes. There was a site called Schöningen, which is before Neanderthals, much before Neanderthals. It's a very old site. It's in Germany. Spears were found on a lake bed with a bunch of horse remains, in fact. But these are not shown to be hardened. I think it's Mareike Stahlschmidt, 2015, that publication that shows that we actually don't have great evidence for fire at Schöningen. But I do think hardening tips, I do think that was a very possible technology. Fire can give so many benefits. I think it's part of the reason that I'm really interested in studying fire. It's filling in this part of the invisible record, right? And I do know from the charcoal, the burned wood that people have studied, these researchers are the ones that discovered, oh, they're burning dry and rotten wood to get smoke. So there's much to be done and really exciting research on the charcoal side of fire studies as well.
Our next question comes from Pete. Let's see here. Who is interested in finding if anything about fire as a light or a lamp, or I would assume maybe even a torch.
Yeah, so I think the clearest examples of torches that have been discovered or described are actually from some of the upper Paleolithic caves in France, because it does seem that human beings are using torches and they're kind of knocking the charcoal off, or they're, touching it against the wall. So we have these torch marks as these humans are walking through these spaces. Now, in terms of Neanderthals, I do not think we have any evidence of torches or lamps. This might change, though. That would be very cool. There's one cave in which we do have examples of Neanderthals exploring the cave very, very deep. This is actually, I'm trying to think, it's around 165,000 years ago, but we don't see torch marks. We actually see bits of burned bone. And this site is actually pretty famous. Because I'm speaking live, of course, it's skipping me, but this is actually the cave that got me interested in burned bones, Bruniquel. Oh my God, I'm gonna feel so stupid for forgetting that. But at the site of Bruniquel, deep in the cave, the Neanderthals were making stalagmite and stalactite circles. So they were using the calcium carbonate and breaking them and making these circle shapes. And burnt bone is found in and around them. And I remember reading that article when I was entering graduate school, being like, oh, this is definitely what I have to do. How can we use these burnt bones to see how hot the fire was that deep in the cave, how bright it was? So maybe not a torch, but there is positive evidence of Neanderthals in deep caves with fire. But I'm not the one to study Bruniquel, so I'm not entirely sure what their results are showing. But I do think it's going to be really cool when we find out.
Well, thank you for your question, Pete. Now we have one from Megan. Are all the burnt bones from animals, or have you found evidence of human remains?
So I actually have only found burnt bones of animals, and this is when they are identifiable. So because burning means that bones are quite fragile, they break quite easily. So it's pretty rare to have identifiable burned remains. But for some sites with excellent preservation, like my work at Roc de Marsal, I do find a lot of identifiable remains, and they have all been animal. There was one, I'm just thinking now, I found 4 pieces of a vertebra at Roc de Marsal. And I'm not sure how familiar people are here with zooarchaeology, but they are vaguely human-sized, and like my heart stopped. But upon a closer look, they're clearly wild boar. So around the size range, but not human. And in terms of cremation, that's where a lot of this burned bone literature comes from. A lot of people working in burned bone work on like Viking burials, medieval work. Cremations were quite common, and we can learn a lot about cultures by studying the remains of bones from these cremations. But for Neanderthals, I haven't quite found them yet. And I do know, maybe our audience is familiar, there's a new analysis shortened to ZOOMS, but it stands for Zooarchaeology by Mass Spectrometry. So it's, if you want to look it up, it's ZOOMS. Now, ZOOMS can actually use the proteins in tiny bone fragments that have no identifiable morphology. It can use the proteins and tell you what species it is, because each species have different signatures, have different fingerprints in terms of their proteins. So this has been used successfully to identify human fragments from things that look like cornflakes. It's truly amazing. But in terms of burnt bone, when you burn bone, you actually lose a lot of the proteins. They're burned off. So, and maybe one day there will be advances made with the ZOOMS analyses so they can study burned bone, and then we can check those non-identifiables to see if any of them are human. But for now, I have not come across any. That would be super cool.
That is, yeah, we'll have to I will add that article to our
Well, okay.
description so that anyone can access it.
Cool.
We have quite a few questions. I'm going to try to get through them as quickly as we can. So the next one comes from Corey. Is there any evidence for changes in Neanderthal fire making or usage that coincide with their disappearance?
Corey, that's an excellent question, and exactly why I'm studying. I put this proposal together with the Leakey Foundation, and I'm so grateful I was chosen as a grantee, because I think this is a big question, right? So the site of Le Moustier is some of the last Neanderthals in the region, and at the top of that sequence, I'm seeing less evidence for fire. And in the evidence for fire that I do see, I don't know. I do have the data, and I need to work through some hypotheses to try to say something. Can I see anything about behavior? Le Moustier is a bit strange, though, or it's a different situation from sites like Roc de Marsal or Pech Fort, because all of the fire evidence, in fact, all of the evidence, has been slightly altered by water movement. So they're not in their exact placement. It's all been jumbled. But still, with my type of study, I can take the average. I can still learn about the average fire types that were around at the time. But the strongest evidence for fire, the clearest anthropogenic signals for fire at Le Moustier come from lower down. So I definitely want to ask this question. And by addressing the fire use in the Kina at one of my other sites, Comgrenal, I also hope to address this. if we understand better how Neanderthals before their extinction were making and using fire, it will let us really hone in at some of the last examples we have of Neanderthal populations on the landscape and really check out, okay, now what's happening here. So I think you've touched on like an active research question. I'm sorry, I don't have an exact answer, but I hope I can use Lemurtiae to address some hypotheses.
That was phenomenal. I was so fascinating. I know, it's very exciting. Like, I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna keep on going with questions because we have a lot.
Okay.
Our next one comes from Michael Smith. Can't it presume that if there was a presence deep in the caves, that they must have been some light source?
Yeah, I think, yeah. So for the example of Bruniquel, where we have the burnt bone, I think that excites me because we can see maybe more exactly how bright it was, what the temperature was. So this can give us some insight into how far they could see or what the type of light or what did they come prepared with to see deep in that cave. But I do think, especially for the time periods in which Neanderthals and modern humans are in, if they're that far in the cave, they got to see, right? Although so much of how we interpret the archaeological record is through our 2024 lens. So maybe that's a modern human presumption, and maybe they were navigating a different way, or it was a rite of passage to navigate in the dark and to make it back. So I think I certainly have the presumption that they most likely had a way of seeing, and I hope I can use bone to say something specific about how they got back there. But yeah, I always need to remind myself to stay objective and to not use my 2024 lens to interpret agent behavior.
So our next question comes from Tam. And do we have any idea of how long a period individual fire pits were used?
Sam, I'm so happy you asked that question. A lot of my experimental work is actually based on duration. So I'm using bone to establish duration thresholds, like length of time. And I've gotten some pretty exciting evidence in my experiments. I can distinguish under 3, above 9 hours, and I'm hoping to get some finer tuned data to address that. So what actually happens is that when a bone is burned, first the organics char and carbonize, and that's that black color, and then they go away. And then the white color of highly burnt bone isn't because of anything to do at high temperatures. It's just that all the organics are eliminated. All that char is eliminated. So it turns out that you can eliminate char at low temperatures too, but they have to last a really long time, like 48 hours. So because of my mix of analyses, observations I make with my eyes on surface texture, on color, and then going to the spectroscopic analysis and see what's happening on the micro and macro or nano and micro level, I can start to put together, oh my God, the organics are gone from this bone, but it wasn't experiencing high temperatures. So it gives me a duration flag. And then I can look using an analysis called XRD, I can look at the relative size and shape, the average crystallite shape of the mineral portion of bone, the bioapatite, and I can say, oh wow, it was a long fire. So I'm very proud of this. I hope to employ it in the archaeological setting. And actually, when I received this result from my experiments, I went back to my collections of roc de Marsal and Pêche and resampled them to test for duration. So they're actually at the lab now. So that should get back to me before I publish those papers, so I can give, and especially for roc de Marsal, in which we have the different combustion features, I really hope to say this one was 4 hours, this one was 9 hours. I'm seeing if I can get that high of a resolution, but I certainly think it is so important when it comes to function to consider duration. When I was studying like the ethno-archaeological records of how modern living hunter-gatherer populations use fire, the major distinguishing factor between different types of fire was the length. So I'm super excited about this aspect of fire use. And I think I will be able to say something about that for Neanderthal fires, but currently I'm waiting for the data to come back to me.
Oh my God, wow.
No, I wish I had the answer now, though. I'm so sorry.
I know. Well, science is a process, and like having more questions is the exciting part.
Yeah.
So we have a couple questions that are similar. One
Okay.
comes from Richard, which is how did they actually make the fire? And the second one is from Matthew. Is there any evidence of what method that might have been used for the start the fire in those early examples? So I guess kind of like both early and then more recent.
Yeah. So because the fire evidence, like the 1 million year ago example, is so ephemeral, I don't think we have any way to test the questions of how it was made. And when we think about how we know fire can be made, right? There's the physical ways. There's the twigs in tinder. There's that you can like hit flint and make sparks, right? In tinder. But you also can go out into the landscape and capture or curate natural fire, a very quest for fire-esque way of curating fire. Now, yeah, for the Wonderwork example, I don't think we have any positive evidence. And I think maybe this is something that the leaky viewers the Lunch Break Science viewers have noticed. Sometimes it's very hard to test archaeological questions because if the evidence is invisible, if it doesn't preserve, we have no way of like finding out. I know that there has been some evidence in Neanderthal contexts and modern human contexts of Neanderthals and modern humans striking flint and striking special types of stones to make sparks. There's a researcher who documented use wear that might be, or high likelihood of being able to be linked to this type of behavior. But I think this is a very hard question to ask. And with bone, I don't know if I can address it specifically, but hopefully I can provide all the other details about a fire, and then maybe another researcher will come and can use my data as complementary evidence to support the hypotheses that they're testing. Because that would give us so much information about how fire was shared, how the fire technology spread. So I hope there's one day a way for us to get that information, but right now it's another unknown.
Let's see, what is our next question? From Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer. Would the high temperature of the fires be due to the length of time that the fires were being burned? Or I get like they could also just be like really, really hot.
Yeah. So I think we have two different dimensions. We have the type of combustibles, the type of fuel being added. And if there is enough and if they are ready to be burned, it's possible to get pretty high temperatures pretty fast. But for thinking about the high temperatures with a bigger fire that lasts a long time, that's probably also possible. And when we think about the lifetime of a fire, there's going to be changes in temperature, right? So they can be lower, higher, need more fuel, get more fuel. For burned bone, the lens in which I study fire, I see the maximum temperature. And hopefully this lens of duration can give me a bit more detail about what's going on as well. But I do think it is possible to have both a hot fire from a really long-lasting big fire, as well as from a really big but short fire with just an appropriate amount of fuel. So when the XRD work comes back for Roc de Marsail, I'll be able to say more specifically the length of some of those bigger and hotter fires. And I hope there's a way that you can see that information because I'm certainly interested in it.
This question kind of builds on that. What methods did you use to determine the temperature of the fire?
Yeah.
And that's from Madison. Thank you. Great.
Thank you.
Like these are such great questions. Like it's just wonderful. Thank you everyone out there for submitting questions. And be sure if you have not submitted your questions, get those questions in the chat because we will be taking only a few more.
Okay. Thank you everyone for all your great questions. I love talking about this and it's been so fun to see what you're curious in and thinking about really sharp questions too. So Madison's question about the temperature, I use several spectroscopic analyses because again, the color can be tricky. Not only can it be staining and not actual burning, but also I told you with the duration, it's possible to get different colors even though it hasn't experienced the high temperatures. So even though I always use color as my first pass to sort a burned assemblage, I really am using the spectroscopic analyses to get finer detail information about the temperature. So I get most of my temperature data from an analysis called FTIR, which stands for Fourier Transform Infrared Spectroscopy. There's two major ways of using FTIR. The ATR method, which stands for Attenuated Total Reflectance, ATR, if you're looking this up. And there's also a KBR method. I usually use the ATR method. The KBR method has you literally mixing some of the burnt bone with potassium bromide, right? But I think both they give you different information, actually. So I hope I can actually expand to both ways of using FTIR as I establish my temperature data. But what this tells you, and like, can you imagine? Okay, you know when like you shine a flashlight on your hand and like the shadow shows up on the wall behind you? Imagine that your hand is actually a bone and the light being shone on it is actually infrared light. And instead of seeing a shadow, you actually see the bonds that are inside the bone that you shot the infrared light at. And these bonds are corresponding and change with thermal alteration to bone. So I can evaluate things like there are certain changes to the chemical structure of bone that only happens with heat. So I can look for them. They happen at different thresholds. So I can say, like, oh, well, this hasn't experienced 700 C yet. Oh, this looks a lot more like it experienced 500 degrees Celsius. And the timing of when the organics and when the water leaves the bone as well with burning also gives me information on that lower temperature range. So FTIR is pretty cheap. It's pretty easy to do. I think it can give a wealth of information about burning. And when I publish my data sets, I will be publishing my FTIR spectra. And there are some open access programs to play around with the spectra. So when the Rock Demersal and Pesh papers are published, please feel free to play around with those spectra, and you'll be able to see specifically how I established that data. And I've actually published 2 papers on my experimental work so far, and they go into great detail about how I'm putting my thresholds, what changes I'm looking for that give me information about the different temperatures experienced by these bones. So maybe, if you Google Scholar my name, they should come up, and I'm really trying to make sure all my papers are open access, so you could look at them without any university affiliation.
Thank you so much. And again, we'll add any of the articles you have mentioned to the description.
Okay.
When we first met, you mentioned your site's impressive efforts to incorporate green philosophy in the collection and site process. Tell us more about that.
I am so happy to have a chance. I forgot today. I'm so sad.
So that's why I'm just like, I wouldn't let you get away without mentioning it. Anyway, go ahead.
So not only do I have an opportunity to excavate with and work with these really exciting teams doing excellent research in southern France, and they have been so accommodating of my food allergies, but also they're making really intense initiatives to make archaeology more green. And I didn't think about that at all before I joined this team, but it's so true. Archaeologists move through a great amount of plastic. There's a great amount of waste. So I've learned so much from the small steps that they are taking, in fact, to make archaeology greener, and we all can do our best efforts, right? And one of the techniques that they do, our bones are only given a bag at the final stage of processing. So usually, or on prior sites I've worked with, there's dirty bags, and you put bones in dirty bags, and you have to throw the bags out because they can't be used again, or you try to wash them and then dry them. At both Comgrenal and Le Moustier, there's a process with locking boxes with labeled box cardboard separators. So bones and lithics can move through the process of post-fouille or post-excavation lab work without being assigned plastic bags until they're in that final stage. And we're also using paper tickets that are laminated. And this is saving so many plastic bags. So I'm really proud to be a part of them, and I'm so grateful that they have started me thinking about what I can contribute to making a more eco-friendly, a greener archaeology. And they've actually published papers as well, so I'll add that, about the steps that they take and how they thought about this process, so other archaeological teams can start incorporating this into their practice as well. I'm very proud of them.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear how mindful that your site is about the environmental impact and also just inclusivity. We're actually excited to share that the Leakey Foundation became a certified carbon neutral organization last year, and that and offsets all of our environmental impacts, including our grantees' travel and lodging, which is really wonderful. And this milestone reflects, our deep commitment to the planet, with plans to further embed sustainability into every aspect of the organization. So, check out. We're going to share a link in the chat about our initiative. So check that out. And again, it's important. So, anyway, We have some more questions. Let's see here. Who is next? William. How do you determine this if the sites are Neanderthal and not Homo sapien?
So there's a few ways. Right now, the record is so well studied. We know, this tool is typically found with Neanderthals, and this tool is typically found with Homo sapiens. And also, we have a pretty well established timeline about when we think Homo sapiens are entering Europe. So if it's after 50,000 years ago, we can start thinking about, is it possible that these are Homo sapiens, not Neanderthal? But what I think this question really accurately points out is that a stone tool can be made by anyone. And potentially there are differences in how Homo sapiens and Neanderthals made their stone tools, but does it mean that a Neanderthal could not have made a human style or a modern human style stone tool if they were taught? And we know for sure that there are a lot of interaction between these groups. They are certainly meeting each other and having children with each other. So whether the groups were separated or if it was a one-time event, it's really hard to see the population dynamic, but we do know that they met. And that's why all populations that carry out of Africa ancestry have some Neanderthal DNA, because Homo sapiens met Neanderthals as they dispersed throughout the world. So a stone tool isn't exactly the best way to distinguish modern human and Neanderthal, but we are now incorporating a lot of techniques looking for ancient DNA in sediment. And I think this is one of the coolest advancements that's happened. It was described in 2017. The paper is Sloan et al. 2017. So they're able to draw Neanderthal DNA or modern human DNA from the sediment. And you must imagine they're living on this, they're sleeping on it, maybe they're using the bathroom on this sediment. All of this leaves DNA, and if it's well preserved, you can find it. We still have a lot of questions about how the DNA is moving through the sediment. I know there's a lot of active projects right now addressing it, but in this paper that I just mentioned, the site of Truro West, which is one of the sites I study the fire of, they have positive evidence of Neanderthal DNA in the sediment. So you've just touched upon not only like the classic way of assessing if it's Neanderthal or modern human, but the newer ways, because it would be so much fun to find like a Neanderthal style stone tool, but modern human DNA or vice versa. And because of the interaction, there was a lot of hybridization. So yeah, what type of stone tool did the hybrid make? Most likely the group that they were with. So who you are potentially does not determine the culture that you are producing. And archaeologically, we previously only saw the culture, and now we can get the DNA. So I think it's pretty cool.
Our next question comes from Orb, and it kind of expands upon this. Were Neanderthals the only species to use the cave for habitation? Is there any evidence of other groups using it?
So we do have modern humans, even in southern France, the same region that I'm studying. Once modern humans enter Europe, they're also using these rock shelters and caves. So it does seem that Neanderthals are primarily basing their activities in the shallower parts of the cave. So right under the drip line, on the terrace of that cave, and maybe a little bit in the cave. There are some caves like Abric Romani in Spain, and this cave is really quite big, and there are Neanderthal occupations farther in and fire farther in. So that's one example of fire that isn't restricted to around the drip line area. But yeah, rock shelters and caves were really excellent for protection, really useful in terms of likely keeping things dry. There's one site that I'm working on studying the fire of. So I haven't studied it yet, but I'm in the process of, called Abri Castanet. This is also a site that I excavated with the team when I was a student. So it's so cool to return as a researcher and like ask another question. But this site looks like it's a rock shelter occupied by modern humans, and they potentially put up hides over the face of the rock shelter to keep out wind. And it looks like they have 3 distinct combustion features, and they potentially were using one for light, putting the other waste material in another. And we know that this occupation was in a winter period, so when it was really cold, like glacial periods in Europe. So having the opportunity to shelter in this rock shelter tells you that they were doing their best to survive in this environment. And we can look at the strategies they took, in both in terms of fire and protection from the wind, to get through those hard winters.
Incredible. I just like, there's so many, like, we could go on all day. We have, I think we have one more question from our viewers, which is, were Neanderthals using fire for their glue creation or trying to smelt?
So this is also an excellent question. Everyone in our audience is picking up on like the hottest topics in fire technology. So there is a researcher who has done a great deal amount of experimental work on what it would take to produce birch glue, and they have shown that the glue that can come from the byproduct of like sap and birch is possible to be made with the types of fires Neanderthals created. So they haven't found positive evidence of glue necessarily, but they have shown the very simple steps that would make it possible with the type of fire technology Neanderthals had. I do know some people who are working on useware and examining stone tools closely, and there has been some reports of like adhesives. So I think you need to pay attention to this question over the next decade, because not only hopefully will we have better ways of finding, and also it's been hard to find in the past, because usually when stone tools were taken out of the ground, they were washed roughly and prepared to look nice and clean, therefore washing any evidence of what would have been glue off it. So now that we have different, better methodologies for excavations, I do think if we will find evidence, it can come up. It can be seen. I do think the types of fires Neanderthals had would be conducive to this type of behavior. Because the birch glue is kind of invisible, it's hard to say if I have any evidence of that. But I also think once I start working on determining the different durations of the Rock de Marçal fires, we'll be able to really think, okay, what is my hypothesis for a short fire of this temperature duration, or a long fire of this temperature and this duration? And we can start to think about what functions would fit best with the types of fires that we see. So this is what I can contribute from my side. And maybe, again, I love working in these large collaborative teams. The sites I study are so well researched, really excellent work is done there. So the more work, the more collaborations that we can do, hopefully I can have everything established for that glue person to come and see what they need to see about the types of fires I've documented. But for now, I don't have any positive glue information.
Do you have, this will be our last question, unless anybody has a quick question they want to put in or they feel like their question wasn't asked. There's a lot of comments, so we've tried our best to get everyone's question answered. My question to you is, do you have any advice for those just starting out or hoping to pursue a career in science?
I definitely do. And I remember when I was in high school, I had a careers class, and I said that I wanted to be an archaeologist, and the career person said, "Oh, that's not a real job. You have to pick another one for this class, or I won't give you a good grade." And I was like, "Oh, I really thought it was a profession, Oh no." And it turns out it is. So I would say my advice to anyone starting, from scratch is to find the person that does what you do and ask them how they got started, how they picked their schools, how they got involved in research. And this goes from archaeology to biology to chemistry to, I know the Leakey Foundation supports such excellent work done with primates. How do you get involved with primate research? How do you get on your first excavation? Emails are pretty easy to find online, and I know all researchers are so happy to talk about their experience and give you advice specific to their experience and specific to what you would like to do. I know just to add a bit about having and living with severe food allergies and like my digestive disorder, I never thought it was going to be possible for me to like travel and eat in different countries and speak different languages, but it is with enough preparation. And I'm so happy I didn't let people discourage me, and I let myself make my own boundaries and see what felt safe for me and make those decisions for myself. So even if you need accommodations, even if you're worried, if you have chronic illness like I do think there are ways that it's possible. And in fact, being excited and passionate about it is what matters most. So yeah, I find the person that does what you want to do and reach out and see specifically how they've made that decision tree and how they can support you.
Well, Giulia, thank you so much. That was an amazing answer to that question. We have one last question that came in. This is interesting. Maria Marchignan Torres says that we don't know if Neanderthals were smarter than us. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
So this ties into why I want to do archaeology, right? Like this behavioral variability. What's going on with humans in this time period, and how did it set us up for humans today? And I mean, like, as a human, and we're all humans here, right? Like, how cool and what a privilege to get to figure out what happened. Like, even if dolphins are smart, elephants are smart, they don't have the opportunity to find out what happened. So I am hoping that my work on fire can contribute to this question. I only want to, it's very hard to speculate without the data. And I think right now, as an early career junior researcher, I'm really establishing what my data can say to this question. And right now, it looks like my Neanderthals are making fire in smart ways and intelligent ways. They're incorporating things to clean their environment. They're putting fire in smart spots to optimize oxygen and smoke. I don't know. I mean, if we were to poll all human intelligence, I'm not sure if like Neanderthal intelligence is this type of bell curve and humans is this type of bell curve. So Homo sapien, maybe the smartest Homo sapien is smarter than the dumbest Neanderthal, but I'm sure there's a lot of overlap. And this is also why I'm going to start studying modern human fire from the same time periods I'm studying Neanderthal fire, because I want to know what's going on with their contemporaries. What does modern human fire look at exactly the same time period as my Neanderthal fire? So again, this is a question that I can't give a clear answer for, but I'm so excited. I mean, I hope I have a full, this is like a career question. I hope I have a full career so I can think about how my research can contribute to the average intelligence of Neanderthals and our modern human intelligence. But I have to say, I think my Neanderthals are using fire in really smart ways. They're not building pits. They're not putting stones around it. But if it serves the function they need it for, do they need it to be better in those ways? These are now like philosophical questions. But yeah, I'm just really excited and happy to be a human that gets to ask questions about humans. We're the coolest. It's true.
Well, thank you so much. This was a wonderful episode. Thank you so much for your time and all of the work you put in, and both on the project and out in the field and in the lab. And it's a delight to get to hear about a little bit of a sneak peek into what you do.
Thank you so much. I've so appreciated the opportunity to share and to work with you. And I was so grateful and excited to be supported by the Leakey Foundation, not only because it meant I had a chance to do this research, but I also really find myself well aligned with the mission of the Leakey Foundation. And it's so cool to get to be a part of the foundation. So thank you, everyone. I hope we do some really cool Neanderthal research the next couple of years. We can get some of these questions answered.
And then you can come back and tell us about it. So it works out perfect. Okay. Well, again, thank you all for watching and for your amazing questions. It was a wonderful episode. So thank you all for taking a break from your day and feeding your brain with the Leakey Foundation. Until next time, stay hungry for knowledge. Lunch Break Science is brought to you by the Leakey Foundation and made possible by the generous support of the Ann and Gordon Getty Foundation, Camilla and George Smith, and the Joan and Arnold Travis Education Fund, as well as viewers like you. Show your support of Lunch Break Science by subscribing to our channel, clicking on notifications, and giving us a thumbs up, or making a donation to help us create new content. Still craving science and can't wait for the next episode? You can feast on the Leakey Foundation's content library with past episodes, lectures, our podcast origin stories, and more. Thank you all for tuning in, and see you next time.